So good afternoon, everybody. My name's David Dyke. I'm the Programme Director at the Economic Research Council. I'm really pleased to introduce everyone to the first event of our Econ Club, our Econ Club programme. I hope you guys will enjoy it and find it very useful. We've got a very exciting range of prominent speakers that will really expand upon the economic curriculum and hopefully bring it to life with their expertise, really. And today, we're delighted to kick things off with Ben Gardiner, who's the Chief Operations Officer at Cambridge Econometrics, which is a leading global economics consultancy. Ben has recently contributed to Levelling Up Left Behind Places, which is a book that seeks to understand left behind places and the challenges of levelling up. He'll be talking to us today about the importance of levelling up, why places have been left behind, and the progress that has been made. Now, whilst you might not have direct experience of some of the themes of the talk through your studies, they'll be really linked to some of the stuff that you have done before and will do in the not so distant future as well. So you can really see this session as a means of kind of stretching your understanding, really. And to assist with this, we've developed some resources that have been passed on to your teachers as well. Just a bit of housekeeping before you start. The talk will be recorded and made available to you to go over at a later date, or if anyone's missed this session. We'll have a Q&A session towards the end. If you've got any questions, you can type them into the Q&A box as the talk is going on. If you're in a classroom with your teachers, feel free to just ask your teachers those questions and they can type those in as well. Alternatively, if you are viewing independently, just at the start of the Q&A section, you can raise your hand virtually, obviously, and ask your question verbally if you would like to. Okay, cool. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Ben Gardiner.
Thanks very much, David, and hello out there. And thanks to the ERC for inviting me along to give this talk on levelling up and left behind places. As David said, I think although some of the themes may not be directly on your A-level syllabuses, I think it is important to look at applications of spatial inequalities, particularly in the UK, where we all live, most of us anyway, I guess, and how it's being applied in practice and policy, and what economists do in this area, and how they analyze it, and the kind of conclusions they come to, and what theory can be applied, and so on. So what I'm going to do is go through bits of, as David said, the book that myself and co-authors published at the end of last year, December 2020, so it's still quite relevant, even though the fast-moving field. And I should shout out to my co-authors here, Professors Ron Martin and Pete Tyler from Cambridge University, Andy Pike from Newcastle University, and Peter Sunley at Southampton University. So what we're going to do is go through a few main headings. So firstly, what we mean by levelling up and left behind places, how we define them, why is it important, what are the possible reasons why places have been left behind, and what we've learned from past policies that have tried to reverse the left behind nature of these places, and kind of looking a bit forward on what progress has been made on this in the last year since the Levelling Up white paper was launched, and also what I consider a bit more the prospects of this going forward in the light of the most recent policy announcements. And obviously there's a bit of space for the questions for further discussion, where I've put a kind of set of questions for you to consider after this talk, and we'll have some time for Q&A if there's any clarification questions or deeper insights that you want to gain from anything I've presented. So let's go on to the first one, meanings and definitions. So here I'm going to cover what do we mean by levelling up left behind places, touch a little bit on the nature of spatial inequalities, both between and within countries. I think from what I've gathered from the syllabus is you tend to look more and inequalities between across countries rather than within them. But anyway, we'll come on to that. And then the kind of scale of the challenge, if you like, how unequal are we when we're talking about these things? So the first slide here just gives a few little ideas about definitions. And the left behind places are really those that have, well, the name tells you really, have been left behind from the forces that, such as globalization, also the rise of services, which have tended to favor some areas over others. And this also includes more recent shocks, such like the financial crisis and COVID, because what we find when we do analysis of this is that it's the weaker areas that then fall behind further when there are shocks, such as the financial crisis and COVID, because they don't have the capacity to deal with these things, and they're often under-resourced, or just kind of their structures are weak anyway. So they tend to then slip further away and further behind relatively stronger areas. And typically, because of the nature of the forces, globalization and finance and services and so on, that are seen as the forces behind this widening, it's often seen as a typology of high-skilled cities versus low-skilled areas are the winners and losers. But hopefully what I'll show you in the course of the presentation is not quite as simple as that. And you can start to develop different kind of clubs or typologies of left behind places. So it's quite a complex area. It's not simply a kind of black or white situation. And neither is it just a UK phenomenon either. There are plenty of examples if you look around different countries and names that are put on areas that are left behind, like La France Périphérique, España Vaciada, Rust Belt in the US. So this is not a singularly UK phenomenon, but we do believe, and the evidence shows that the UK is one of the more extreme examples of countries where there is this division between the left behind and the pulling ahead places. Okay, and so that kind of broadly defining what we mean by left behind places, the leveling up side of things is really the process by which that decline can be reversed. Obviously, this leads to several kind of questions, which we'll discuss over the course of the conversation, such as what are you leveling up to, how, by when, and also the geography of this, because there are different spatial scales at which you might choose to level up and think about redressing the balance. And we'll explore some of this in the presentation. Okay, now in terms of the spatial inequalities, they've been around for quite some time and have been diverging since about the 1980s, with this idea of kind of superstar regions that have been pulling ahead in terms of productivity, in terms of output. And this has led to kind of a lot of a theme of work which has linked this to social political discontent, nature of Brexit as well, in a sense of wanting to blame somebody or something for being left behind. So it's quite a kind of deep issue. And so many countries, both for the political and economic reasons, have looked to try and devise policies by which they can help these kind of left behind economies, especially in light of the most recent shocks like COVID-19 and also the kind of energy crisis that we're now facing. And UK, as I said, is a prime example of both of those in terms of both the policy aim and the problem. This chart kind of just typifies some of the inequalities and the rise of the inequalities that I've been mentioning. So what it shows is UK on the left, US on the right as an example, international country, and the y-axis going up is really a measure of spread. It's a measure of variance. So how wide are the disparities between different areas within the country? And what you can see from this is from about the 1980s onwards, that spatial disparities and inequalities started to widen in the UK. And that happened at both local authority district area, which is quite a fine degree of spatial analysis, and also more standard regions like West Midlands, Yorkshire and Humberside, East Anglia, and so on, which are the larger ones. Same kind of thing happened in the US at state and metro level area, which are more the kind of finer grain of analysis again. But you can see that in the UK, the speed with which the inequality rose was much faster. But it happened about the same time. So it can be linked to a variety of forces like globalization, trade, international trade took off around the 80s, also financialization with Big Bang in the UK and other global financial centers taking off. Urbanization linked to that as well, growth of cities and population of cities, and general tertiarization as well, and the rise of business services. So there's a lot of forces going on from around the 80s as well as technology, growth of the internet as well, kicking in the 1990s. Now, one thing to say at just the beginning of this is that spatial inequalities have always existed. Yeah, it's not, we're not inventing it in the 1980s. There's a long history for this. As far as you could ever measure anything, there's always been unequal division of activity and prosperity. And no one is saying here that everything should be equal. And there should be no disparity between places or whatever spatial level. So it really comes down to a matter of how much is too much. And obviously at that point, you start to move away from this objective, positive economics towards a more subjective, normative value judgment, which inevitably you have to do in economics if you're going to make any kind of interesting statement at all that's relevant to policy, because that is all mostly about value judgments. So just to set the context of this, in terms you're probably familiar with the A-level syllabus. Okay, so the final one in this section just looks at the UK alone, and it provides an index of a kind of indicator you might be familiar with, GDP per capita. So it's kind of output per head of the whole economy, and using data that we put together with our academic colleagues, we produced a kind of time series, or at least 10-year or so average, looking back to the early 1900s for what we call the standard planning regions of the UK. So it's about 12 of them. And what this showed is that, as I said, inequalities are a long-standing problem. London has been at the forefront of the UK economy for many years. Its average of the index there with the UK is 100. It's 134 by 1911. And you can see it starts to, it's fairly stable to the 1950s and even 70s or so. And it starts to rise rapidly after that. And this is what we're talking about, the rise of London, but also to some extent the Southeast as well, surrounding that area. You also, interestingly, you also see, in the early 1900s, the Northwest and some of the northern regions still doing fairly well on the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution, still happening there. So there's interesting stories to tell just by a simple table here. But the story of London pulling away and all those forces of globalization, tertiarization, financialization, really benefiting some areas much more than others is a big part of the story here, and how other areas haven't managed to reinvent themselves. I would say something about London, because London itself is a myriad of different places, and it is one of the most unequal cities in the world. Certainly the UK, there are pockets of extreme poverty and pockets of extreme wealth. But I'm not going to go into that here, because that's a whole different presentation, maybe one for the Q&A afterwards. Okay, so the next one is the importance of levelling up, which I've shortened the name to Why Bother? Why do we bother levelling up? Why do we care about spatial inequalities? These are the kind of conversations you might have down the pub, or with family. Just really, do you really think that spatial inequalities in the country matter very much? And I've just kind of tried to put a kind of different sides of the argument here across the column. So there's arguments against levelling up and arguments for levelling up. So the ones against often are grouped into responses like, well, it works against the market. So capital investment firms will go where they want to. So they'll go where the returns are, where the growth is, where the skilled labor is. And if you try and, as Margaret Thatcher said, buck the market, you'll end up losing as a result of that. So why waste resources? Previous attempts have failed. And there's little point in trying to kind of stem the tide, as it were. That's also often tied in with what's called an equity versus efficiency argument, which is to say that rather than make all places equal, you should just let those areas that are strong, let them loose, and you'll grow faster if you do that, rather than try and spread the activity across to lower return areas. This is often comes out of HM Treasury as a reason for not investing in deprived areas, despite the social benefits of doing so. Another argument: inequalities within regions are often greater than those across regions. So this is saying that at any spatial scale, you can find inequalities everywhere. So why just focus on one particular scale? It's meaningless to do so because there's inequality everywhere. And the final one is often a kind of mantra put out by politicians, that there should be equality of opportunity and not location. So in other words, what matters is that every person should have the equal opportunity to fulfill their potential, and it's not really about their location at all. So the arguments on the other side that I put together are, well, firstly, a basic one, that if we think that spatial inequality is a market failure, then there's a role for government intervention to reverse that or address that at some point. Also, that it can be shown, and I will do later on, that the spending that has taken place over the decades to reduce these inequalities hasn't failed because it's the market. You can't buck the market. It's failed for lots of other reasons as well. And thirdly, and a slightly different tack, is that I think when you start to get all these inequalities and the country starts to become incredibly unbalanced, it starts to become less meaningful to think about the country and to think about a kind of cohesive identity. And this is where things start to fall apart in terms of populism, populist politics, and the likes of the Independence Party, Brexit, and all this kind of thing starts to boil up. And so for this reason as well, I think these are arguments in favour of not completely having a level playing field, but at least making a go of reducing inequalities. And this often is boiled down to what's called a people versus place argument. So do you really think that it's all about people and investing in people and skills and letting labour people go where they want and things happen where they want to happen? Or do you think it's about place and the location of the activity, and we should be thinking about not letting places get left behind, not just people? Now, the reality is it's much more complex than that, and you can't really separate the effects of place and people from one another. So it's a bit of a fallacy to argue on one side or the other when it's, like I said, a lot more complex than that. This just shows an example of some of the analysis we did in the report. It looks at the kind of quantiles of differential growth of employment and value added by local authority area, about 400 across the UK. And what you see in the colours, the reds are the best performing in terms of employment and output. The blues, darker blues, are the worst. What I'm trying to show here is that although there is a kind of strength around London and the southeast with the darker reds, it's by no means a complete picture. And that's in favour of the argument that there's inequalities everywhere. There's strong places everywhere in the north of England. There's weak places in the south of England, in London. So you can't just kind of choose a spatial scale and decide that it's a north-south divide or something like that. It's a lot more complex than that. So obviously I can't go into this in too much detail here, but this is the kind of interesting patterns you get when you analyze the data at this kind of spatial level. In terms of what economic theory has to say about this, it becomes kind of interesting and hopefully more familiar for you with your A-level syllabuses. And what I've tended to put here is kind of two groups of theories. Firstly, the neoclassical Keynesian, and secondly, the agglomeration and cumulative causation theories. So often economics at A level is contrasted between the neoclassical and the Keynesian, neither of which have much to say about spatial inequalities, as it happens. The neoclassical approach tends to be quite simplistic because they didn't really consider space very much when it came to looking at analysis. It's basically all about equalization of returns to capital and labor, to the marginal prices. And what ultimately happens in this kind of world is that you get convergence. So if you leave everything without intervention, which is largely a neoclassical world, without too much need for government, let the market decide, there should be equality of GDP per capita, give or take the kind of initial conditions about where they started from, which again is a bit of a weak point with neoclassical economics. There's no start point to these things. Obviously, that hasn't actually happened. We've seen, the economies diverge, but we'll come on to that in a minute. On the Keynesian side, it's about demand management, and so you could argue inequality is a market failure. So you could argue there's a case for government spending to help areas where demand is deficient. But I've read up on this a little bit, and I've seen some arguments that Keynes wasn't actually in favor of necessarily reducing inequality. So I don't claim to know too much about that. I think that's an interesting discussion that could be had, whether or not the Keynesian economics is really about spatial inequalities or just letting things go the way the economy is going. But we could talk about that. Other two theories, agglomeration, cumulative causation. Well, agglomeration largely came about in the 80s and was seeking to explain really why development was uneven and wasn't converging. It has been put within a neoclassical framework and revolves around the idea of increasing returns as opposed to the decreasing returns that you get in the neoclassical world. So what happens is you get a virtuous circle, as in the diagram here. As the city grows, the returns to investing more in those cities increases, which explains why firms do that. So they don't just kind of go where the capital is cheapest. Let's say it's the north of England, and stay in the south where the capital is more expensive because it's more in demand. They keep going there because the returns are higher and can generate more benefits and more economies of scale. Now, diseconomies do exist within this framework, and you can probably think of a few, such as house prices, such as congestion, rents, or kind of lack of space, even well-being as a diseconomy if you live and work in London. But the problem there is that governments often act to remove these. The theory works if, left to itself, the diseconomies build up to such a level that activity then spreads elsewhere, because it's a balance between the benefits of investing in a high return area versus the diseconomies of staying there and suffering from the congestion, the high prices, and so on. But if governments then invest in, let's take London as the example, classic in the UK. If governments then invest in Heathrow, invest in Crossrail, they're actually not letting the market do what it, or let the theory do what it's supposed to do. They're allowing the accumulation to increase and increase and increase, and thus enhancing the inequalities even further. Now, the cumulative causation theory works on a similar basis, but it's not so much an urban-rural type thing. It's much more driven by exports. but the same principle of activities, income, investment, leading to higher productivity and higher returns is there. So it's theories seeking to explain what's actually observed, as opposed to the neoclassical world, which has a theory which isn't observed very often. So these are the two kind of groups of theories that are very much in play. Certainly the agglomeration theories are central to some of the leveling up recommendations, as we'll see. Okay, so number three, why places have been left behind. Well, there's a number of fairly good arguments why that is the case. Firstly, the post-industrial transition, by which we mean even now, to some extent, a hangover from the kind of heavy industrial past in many cities, particularly in the north, but elsewhere as well, and coupled with a failure to reinvest and reinvent themselves in other areas when faced by cheaper and more competition from initially the US in the early part of the 1900s, and more recently Japan and then China. So failure to compete on manufactured products leads to decline. Failure to reinvent in new areas such as services lead to even more decline and weakness. So it's this kind of strong manufacturing decline without the offsetting growth in services that many cities have seen. And there's a combination of different effects across urban, rural as well. KIBS means knowledge-based investment services and other services. These tend to grow quite fast in different areas. So what you end up is a kind of very complex shift between the different types of areas, and we've explored this in the book by coming up with kind of typologies of different types of area and how they've been affected by output and employment growth. And yeah, I think I'll kind of crack on because time is ticking. The point is, there are many different reasons why places have been left behind, and you can't just put one policy on it. You have to address the multitude of reasons why places have been left behind in order to understand it properly. This gives you a flavor of the types of typology which we investigated in the book, and it looks at the type of place ranging from village to cities, core cities, which are the kind of key main ones in the UK outside of London, ranging from small to large towns. And you can see there's a variety of different growth of employment, growth of productivity. So employment has tended to be favored in the smaller locations, the less dense locations, apart from London, which dramatically increased from the 90s. Whereas productivity growth and levels tend to be dominated by the city areas where the returns are highest for the capital to be invested. Similarly, if you look at the decline of production employment, it's been heaviest in the core cities, most of which are in the north of England, but also London. London was actually quite a strong manufacturing city not that long ago, and it suffered greatly, but it reinvented itself. It had service growth employment which offset that, which many of the core cities haven't had. So these are the kind of typologies that we've developed to try and understand the nature of this complex problem a bit more effectively. And this shows another way of cutting this by dividing this same typology of place by north and southern regions. And again, you can see quite different patterns in the same measure of how employment growth has changed since the early 1980s. The northern settlements have typically all been a kind of downward slope decline in employment, whereas many of the southern settlements are, most of them anyway, have actually shown employment growth increasing. So a diverse spread of different behaviors and different experiences. Okay, and this is again the final one in this. Looks at the different types of settlement across the north and what it means to be a left behind place. So what we took was the growth of employment and growth of output from the 1980s until 2018, which is when the data ended that we were looking at for the study, and look to see where the bottom areas were in terms of these growth rates. were they typically village, rural? Were they typically core cities, other cities, and so on? And how many of these were in the north? Thinking about the kind of typical north-south divide that's often mentioned in the UK. And what you find is that it's often the medium large towns that have suffered, but not completely. But the majority are in the north. So while it's not completely a north-south divide, there is a strong prevalence of left behind places to be located in the northern areas. So this industrial hangover, failure to reinvent, failure to get investment from government is still a very strong argument to make, but not complete. So moving on to lessons from past policies, and what has been done in the past to explore these kind of problems, and to what extent are we just reinventing, or is it a kind of new wine in an old bottle, as it were, or old wine in a new bottle, whichever it is. The nature of the problem, we uncovered a book dating back to the 1940s from the Barlow Commission, and it's all about redistribution of activity away from London. So you can see the quote here. I won't bore you with reading it out to you. It could be, it could be now, it could be today. That kind of phrase is very much still with us, 80 years on from when it was made. The main difference is this, the purpose of the redistribution here was partly to do with World War II, and they didn't want all the activity being bombed in one place. So it made more sense to redistribute it elsewhere around the country. Whereas now it's not so much that, it's more about just the agglomeration forces, the nature of the activities and the types of areas that are benefiting have tended to be in London and surrounding areas, or pockets of London anyway, and surrounding areas. So it's a long-running story, as is the nature of the inequalities themselves. And where spatial policy went after that was largely to follow these recommendations of the Barlow report and to spread activity around at least up to the 1970s, 80s, and then it became a little bit more fragmented. Policy became a bit more focused on cities, in line with both the whole agglomeration arguments for economists. I mentioned that the agglomeration theory developed around this time, and also because the forces that were developing in the economy were typically urban and city based. The globalization, the technology, these are all benefiting collections of people, urban densities, rather than old northern industrial towns. What we also did at some exhaustive element was to review all the past policy attempts at redressing spatial inequalities. And we came up with a list of reasons why past policies haven't done what they were supposed to do. And this, again, counters this argument of, well, policies failed, so why bother to try and fight the market, as it were. And so these are a range of different reasons why we believe that policies haven't worked. And I think they can be summed up in four broad categories. One is not enough money. Secondly, not enough vision from government in terms of what they're aiming for. Thirdly, they've been trying to be too top down, centralized, trying to control things from one place, typically London, rather than allowing localities to take their own path and make their own choices. And finally, too much churn, too much different scattergun policies occurring all over the place to make any consistent sense of things. And this chart next, I won't, you don't need to understand it too much. All it registers is a number of policies that have been tried since the late 1970s to try and redress the balances. So you've got local schemes at the bottom to moving up to more macro regional schemes at the top. In the book, all the different schemes are numbered. But the sheer scale of them, 50 policies, all aiming to do different things, it's just bewildering for me. And scale of it, isn't it? Is it any wonder why there's so much churn? It's impossible to get any traction in these areas. And what we've also done is to try and differentiate different types of policy in the model, in the book, sorry. These range from the spatially targeted, which are typically the top-down policies, where central government decides and imposes targets on all areas, and we'll see this tends to be exactly what's happened in the Levelling Up white paper, all the way down to place-based, which are much more bottom-up, more autonomy for local areas and regions in deciding their own fate, and more democratically accountable as a result of that to local voters. So these are the kind of contexts within which we see policies and how they're framed. So this really summarizes the lessons from past policies. We do believe that they did actually create jobs in the areas they were intended and improve activity, but there was no lasting impact because policies were turned around, there was churn, underfunded, inconsistent, and so on. So this has been a consistent problem with UK regional policy over decades, and whether this will change is a major point going forward, I think. Okay, final section, just looking at where we are now and where we go from here. So we've had the Levelling Up white paper now published after a long wait in February this year. And this announced 12 missions with a deadline of 2030. But there were definite issues still remaining about the scale of the funding and the commitment of the government to this, drawing parallels with the amount of funding that Germany is engaged in with its East-West reparations. This is, the Levelling Up fund is dwarfed by the German example and the commitment to it as well. So the problem being here with setting a target of 2030 is, as I've shown, these imbalances have emerged over many decades, and thinking that you'll be able to solve them within what is now kind of 8 years is virtually a thankless and impossible task. So the point we make in the book is that these kind of inequalities emerge, they're cumulative, they're long-term, and you need to understand the nature of that before you can even hope to address them with any meaningful policy. And it's also more than just an economic issue, it's a political issue as well, and a social cultural issue. Now, I won't dwell on this too much because time is ticking, but the metrics for how you measure level up are very important in terms of what you're leveling up to, by when, we've said 2030, the mix of criteria, the interdependencies between targets, whether they're spatially targeted or whether they're place-based. There's a whole debate going on and still going on to some extent once the Levelling Up white paper was published about whether they've got it right. And I think the consensus is generally that while it's great that something has been published, there are many deficiencies with what's there that need to be corrected and fine-tuned. So views across different studies, these are the kind of areas that different studies have put forward that places should be leveled up on. So whether it's the economic side, which is typically the easier to measure and easier to argue, the more cultural or environmental social side, which tend to be harder to measure, but are nonetheless important, certainly when it comes to life expectancy, well-being. And the political side, where you can bring in the argument about improving belonging and the kind of social cohesion, but also the more cynical side about it all being about votes and the red wall effect and the Conservative Party wanting to remain in power. I couldn't possibly comment on that, obviously. This all links in, I haven't mentioned this yet, with the 6 capitals framework, which introduced a whole new kind of theory into the lexicon of spatial inequalities, because it hadn't really been talked about much before the Levelling Up white paper came along. I've shamelessly copied here the kind of page from the Levelling Up white paper. The only comments I would have is, well, several along the right-hand side. Environmental capital is missing. Why is that? I still haven't seen a good argument for that. We're in the massive crisis of climate, and one of the biggest kind of capital definitions is missing from the whole thing. It also tends to compartmentalize these capitals and doesn't allow for interrelationships and trade-off. And there doesn't often seem, when you read the Levelling Up white paper, to be much of a theory involved in how it all fits together, because you need that theory in order to then move on to policy recommendations. So these are the 12 missions, which aren't so different from what I was talking about earlier. A few extra ones in there, the global competitive city thing in every region. That's a throwaway to agglomeration theory, as is the public transport, improving economic density, along with a lot of other social ones as well. What I would say finally, in terms of, do I think this is all going to work or not, is that the kind of political economy of the situation is that there are three main constraints to doing anything in the UK. One is we are largely a financialized economy. That, if anything, if anybody's been seeing the news over the last 48, 24 hours with all the thing about bankers' bonuses, trickle-down economics, we are dominated by London and the financial centre. And this has a massive control over the treasury and public spending and where it goes, and this efficiency equity argument. And until that balance is redressed and until that changes, I don't think you'll see a huge willpower to seriously fund and seriously commit to any kind of redress of spatial imbalances. Secondly is the over centralization of government in London. That has started to shift. That is a good thing in the devolution white paper, in the Levelling Up white paper. There were active movements to devolve power. What we're uncertain about at the moment is how far that will really go. There is reasonable evidence to suggest that places with more autonomy and more decision making to in charge of their own fates do better. It stands to reason they will. But this needs to be backed up with adequate funding to do that. The final one is really the political thing, really, because we've got this adversarial bi-party political system in the UK. And so you can end up with the best policy in the world, but if it's not invented here in their own political party, it just gets thrown out and something else invented. Hence all the policy churn that we've seen over the decades. And even within own parties, one administration moving to another, there are serious questions whether the levelling up idea, as it was largely kind of coined by Boris, will survive the Truss government. She seems to be focusing more on tax cuts and the whole levelling up spatial inequalities thing has seemingly been pushed to one side. So whether or not this all is still relevant or not in another year or two, I don't know, but the spatial inequalities are certainly not going to go away, because really all the private sector wants to be able to invest in deprived areas is certainty and commitment of policy and funds. If they have that over a long enough period for investment to yield returns, they will invest. But if there's churn, if there's uncertainty, no one will go near it. So we won't be in a very good place. Okay, I will stop there. I've put a few questions here. These I don't think, David, are for answering now necessarily, but ones you could take away to the classroom or have a little mini debate, whatever. Or I'm happy to dwell on them a little bit here now if you want. But I'll stop and hand over to any questions that might be emerging.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Ben. It's incredibly insightful. So yeah, as Ben mentioned, please do type in your questions in the section. Alternatively, just raise your hand if there is anybody there that would like to verbally ask a question. I'll just give you a little bit of time to do that.
Do you want me to still share the screen, David, or shall I stop sharing?
You can stop sharing, that's fine.
Okay, fine.
Yeah. Great, thank you very much, Ben. So I did have a few questions that I came up with in the meantime while people are oh no, we've got one there. Okay, we've got one from Norwich School that says if there is a cost involved, how with reduced tax income will this be paid for?
Well, from what I understand, having followed the news like many people, the tax income is going to be met by borrowing. in an environment where interest rates are starting to rise. So there was strong arguments over the last 10 years or so that we should have borrowed when interest rates were a lot lower and tied into that kind of environment. Now interest rates are on the rise, borrowing costs are going to rise. It makes it a lot more difficult to make the argument that your returns on the investment are going to outweigh the cost of that investment. But I mean, principally, as far as I understand, the tax cuts are paid for by borrowing. In the logic being that tax cuts will lead to increased growth. But what they're not, in the context of what I'm talking about, no one is talking about where that growth is going to be. And certainly, I would say it's highly unlikely that most of the growth is going to be in left behind places. It's going to favour the areas that are already doing well. And so this kind of policy will only act to widen spatial disparities even further.
Cool, awesome. And another one here. So in terms of levelling up and political parties, which party has implemented the most schemes to reduce inequality in their reign? Labour over 13 years or the Conservatives over the outstanding 28 years?
I think off the top of my head, probably Labour, because purely from a constituency electorate point of view, many of their core base are in the kind of northern industrial areas that have suffered from the decline, long-term decline that I talked about and showed on the charts, and so have traditionally voted Labour over the years to try and help those areas. And so, yeah, probably directly or indirectly, most of it's Labour. I mean, there have been periods when both parties have not really done very much, and both parties have done something. But it's a whole mix and churn of different political flavors, really. But Labour would edge it, I'm sure.
Okay. Great, thanks. And another one coming in here. How much involvement has the private sector had so far in levelling up, or is it a very state-centric thing? And in addition to that, to what extent do you think moving forward their involvement can or should be increased?
I think the private sector is key to this, because they're the ones that can really channel the investment to generate the jobs and the productivity. The public sector is notoriously bad at picking winners and developing activity by itself. The best role for the public sector is to put in place what I'd call a kind of horizontal support. So get the public infrastructure right, get the schools right, invest in the education systems, just kind of get the bedrocks of these institutions right. And if the private sector sees a commitment, sees a cross-party commitment to levelling up in this way, and this is the whole point. You need cross-party support. You need Labour and Conservative to talk to each other and to agree. In the same way, in Germany, you have a constitutional agreement and rights to level up incomes between East and West Germany. You need something at that kind of level in order to get the consensus, in order to persuade the private sector that it's not just going to be reversed at the next election or even at the next internal party election, as we've seen. And if you were in the private sector choosing to invest in an area, why would you, if you thought a year down the line you're not going to get that investment in infrastructure, you're not going to get that investment in schools or further education colleges that will give you the skilled labor that you need to populate your factories and get people to your businesses. So yeah, I mean, the public sector can play a role, but if a region or local area becomes dependent on the public sector, certainly high proportion of employment in public sector, it's not a good recipe for development. This is what's happened in areas like Northern Ireland. There's an incredibly high proportion of public sector employment there, and is it any surprise that their productivity is some of the lowest? There are other factors as well, obviously, but this is one of the key ones. So private sector is key. but we need to get the institutional environment right for that to happen.
Cool, thank you. There are a couple here that I'm going to take at the same time. The first one being, do you think that investment in green technology can help to close the divide? And I guess at the same time, are there any examples of effective kind of radical levelling up policies that have been implemented elsewhere in other countries that have been successful?
Yeah, so the green technology is an interesting one. Certainly, I mean, we're doing quite a lot of work with Transport for the North, which is the kind of main legalized institutional body that often looks at the kind of north-south divide and tries to develop pan-northern policies. And the kind of green growth issue is a big one for them. For many reasons, there are policies to do with the offshore wind farms, and now increasingly potential for onshore wind farms as well. They've got more space. They've got the kind of elements in their favor in terms of the kind of North Sea side of things, but also on the west side. And and it should be part of it, but yet, as I said, environmental natural capital is seemingly missing from the levelling up framework, and that's why we were scratching our head when we looked at it and thought, well, why? Biggest challenge of our time. Yeah. Why is it not included? And why is a challenge is also an opportunity? It's the other side of the coin. So if there's an opportunity for invest, opportunity for the government to encourage the private sector to develop these areas. Again, we get fracking instead. So go figure. Radical plans. I think I'd probably think of East-West Germany as the kind of most dramatic one, really. And it's interesting because when I first started looking at this quite some time ago now, the north-south divide in the UK, I know it's typology and I know it's a lot more complex than that, but it's the most simplistic way of representing the kind of industrial heritage heartland cities and everything in the London southeast. We used to kind of compare the north-south of the UK with the north-south of Italy, just in reverse.
Yeah. Okay.
As most people know, southern Italy is typified by kind of lower development, lower employment, productivity, and so on, compared to the north of Italy, above Rome, and so on, where a lot of the business and strength is. We don't do that anymore, and the reason is that the inequalities in the UK have gone beyond what's in Italy, and the life expectancies, the life chances, and we are now comparing ourselves with East-West Germany, as it was back in the 90s, when East Germany emerged from kind of communist rule. Pockets of the UK are that bad, and this is where it's just terrible, really, that we've allowed these inequalities to get so bad that life expectancy is so divergent, and other well-being measures, and so we can't ignore this. It will only get worse if you don't do anything. So there has to be a dramatic turnaround. But as on my last slide, I'm somewhat skeptical as whether the forces are in place to allow that to happen.
Just on that again, so what are some of the things that occurred in East and West Germany to kind of alleviate that?
Well, as I alluded to earlier, there was a kind of constitutional agreement to allocate a certain proportion of kind of gross income to rebalance the economy by investing in infrastructure, by investing in education, these kind of fundamental infrastructures and the capitals, if you like. And they also relocated the capital city from Bonn to Berlin. So symbolic, if nothing else, but certainly, could we imagine relocating the capital city from London to York, or somewhere in London to Newcastle? It's that kind of scale of effect. So these are significant things and give a signal that the country and the government and all politicians are committed to change on a scale that we just haven't even attempted in the UK.
Yeah. Okay. We've got another one here. Do you think that levelling up for spatial inequality is the fastest way to grow the economy?
Well, that's an interesting one. There have been studies that shown that countries with the largest disparities and inequalities are the ones that grow slowest. So this kind of counters that efficiency versus equity argument. The other simplistic analogy is, putting all your eggs in one basket, which is largely what the UK has done with London over the last few decades. So do you believe that just allowing London to grow bigger and bigger and bigger and get more congested, house prices diverge, wages diverge, and allowing the city to grow unfettered is a good thing, and it will spill over, and the tax take is good for the rest of the country because that can be redistributed around the country? Or should we actually invest in other urban city areas around the country so we can fire on all cylinders rather than one? I would tend to favour the latter, but there are plenty of people who argue that you should just leave London alone. It's a world-class financial centre. Nobody's denying that. Just that the cards have been stacked in its favour for many, many years. And as I said earlier, if you truly left the markets to go as they would, then the agglomeration of this economy would properly kick in. But that doesn't happen. What we get is more and more investment, more and more government spending. If you look at the spending per capita on transport investment or any form of investment, London gets the lion's share relative to any region. This just accumulates the effect and allows London to grow bigger and bigger. And what you then end up with is a lot of arguments about greenbelt investment and relaxing planning rules to allow it to grow even bigger. It doesn't solve the problem. It's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So I would favour the latter argument. But these are value judgments. It's difficult to prove and impossible to prove one way or the other. If it had been, then we wouldn't be having these discussions. They would have already been concluded. So that's kind of what makes economics an interesting subject. There's you move away quickly from theory to applications, and there is no single truth when it comes to these arguments. There's just different weights of the argument.
Absolutely. Great. Okay, maybe the last one here then. This is something I know nothing about actually, but what do you think?
Hopefully I might have to know.
What do you think of the Cambridge-Oxford ARC project?
Well, that's an interesting one. Our company kind of contributed a bit to that one by looking at the wider economic benefits of the ARC, principally around Milton Keynes, Bedford, the kind of middle area, which was due to and probably would have benefited strongly from employment growth, as people would have been living in those areas and yet potentially working in Cambridge and Oxford with better connections to those urban areas. It had fallen foul of the so I think in a sense it's a good thing. It probably would. You invest in strong areas, you're going to get returns. But it kind of fell foul of the whole levelling up argument that you shouldn't be investing all of your money in already strong areas that will do very nicely anyway without that. And academics and kind of high-tech companies in Oxford and Cambridge have found ways to communicate without the need for a railroad between them, or kind of superfast highway or whatever it will be. So you should invest in other areas around the country to kind of redress that balance. Now, so I had thought that East-West Rail Link or the ARC was largely a dead duck because of that. But now, who's to say that could levelling up be dead itself, and a return to go for growth at all costs, and regardless of spatial, make policies become what's called spatially blind. so you don't really care about the inequality implications of what you're doing. So it could come back. I mean, I don't necessarily think it will boost Cambridge and Oxford that much. It was going to be more of a boost to the kind of areas in between. Cambridge and Oxford will always do very well. They're kind of world-class centres of excellence. So yeah, I kind of overall mixed feelings. I'd like to see more distribution around the UK, but at the same time, it will benefit areas that are also not doing too well in some cases in between the two.
Cool, amazing. Thank you very much. Well, I think as it's just 5 we should probably leave things there. And thank you so much for everything, for the presentation, for all of your time and everything. And I really hope that everybody that's been listening, has found it very useful. I know that I definitely have. Just before we go, just to let you know that the next talk will be with Sir Charles Bean on the 24th of November, but I'll obviously send out emails, etc. before then. Ben, thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure, David. Thanks very much for having me.
Awesome.
Bye, everyone.